Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine, messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage welcoming you to the liberated zone of Freedom Now, a Pan-Africanist and internationalist world affairs program with a jazzy music mix. Our agenda for this Saturday, July 29th, 2023, commences with our sister, Luyanda Kuboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Theresa Runstedtler, associate professor of history at American University in Washington, D.C., and author of 2 books on blacks in sports. Jack Johnson, Rebel Sojourner, Boxing in the Shadow of the Global Color Line, and Blackball, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Spencer Haywood, and the Generation That Saved the Soul of the NBA. Then, later this hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Jacob Dorman, Associate Professor of History at the University of Nevada, Reno, here to discuss his recently published article, Western Civilization Through Eastern Spectacles, Duse Mohamed Ali, Black Orientalist Imposture, and Black Internationalism. We will hear from Prison Radio commentary from Marsha Bird on fasting and prayer. Our music clip mix includes Charlie Parker, Pancho Sanchez, Horace Silver, Miles Davis, and more. So sit back, tell a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Sister Luyanda Kuboka with this July 25th weekly African Drumbeat historical calendar of events and freedom fighters whom we refuse to ignore. So here at Freedom Now, we give these events and role models life by acknowledging their deeds. July 25th, 1973. Amy Jacques Garvey crosses over. She helped build the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Community League, and when her husband was imprisoned, she took over its leadership. July 25th, 1972. The U.S. health officials admitted using Africans as guinea pigs in the Tuskegee syphilis experiments for over 40 years, providing them with aspirins under the guise of treatment. July 26, 1927, Heidi Santa Maria was born. She was one of the 6 Cuban women in Castro's July 26, 1953 movement that launched the Cuban Revolution. While imprisoned, she witnessed her brother and fiancé tortured to death by the Batista regime. Their eyes and testicles were brought to her in an effort to break her. Upon her release, she joined the guerrillas in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. After the revolution, she held major positions in the New Cuba. July 26, 1969. The first Pan-African Cultural Festival was held in Algeria, bringing together the varied aspects of the African world. July 26, 1956. President Nasser of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal to break the neo-colonial control of African national resources. July 27, 1915. The United States invades and colonizes Haiti, setting in motion a long anti-colonial and neo-colonial struggle that continues to this day. July 27, 1937. Open revolt by African workers in Barbados against British colonial rule, one of the hundreds throughout the Caribbean. July 27, 1974, the General Union of Eritrea Women was founded at the Vanguard Association in the Eritrean War of Independence. July 28, 1917, over 10,000 Africans born in the United States marched down New York City's Fifth Avenue in silent protest of the lynching and racial inequalities. July 29, 1824, Alexandre Dumas, the African author of the classic book The Three Musketeers, is born. July 29, 2001, Fulon Devi, the legendary bandit queen who rose from the lower caste child bride to become the leader of a band of outlawed lower caste rebels who were in opposition of the Indian parliament. She was a champion of the rights of lower caste. Devi was married at the age of 11 to an abusive older man. She ran away, but was abducted and gang raped by upper caste men. She joined the band of lower caste outlaws and returned to murder 22 of her attackers, creating a sensation across India. She eluded capture for a period, but surrendered and was imprisoned for 11 years. In 1996, Devi was elected to parliament as part of the Socialist Party. She was gunned down at the age of 37 on her own doorstep. July 29, 1970. Delano, California grape strike ends with a major victory for the Huelga forces of United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez. So-called immigrant farm workers went on strike from 1966, fighting not only the major wine manufacturers, but their mafia henchmen. July 30th, 1945. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the most militant African congressman, was born. Adam Clayton Powell embraced Malcolm X and scores of revolutionaries in a broad alliance to bring about social change in the United States in the 60s. July 30th. Hica da Silva, the Joan of Arc of Brazil, a legendary African slave who rose to immense heights of power as an organizer and leader of slave rebellions to become the unofficial Empress of Brazil. July 1st, 1969, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi led the overthrow of the puppet regime of King Idris, establishing the Libyan Revolutionary Jamahiriya and providing political, military, and economic support for revolutionary movements worldwide, including the United States. This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka with our revolutionary events calendar here at Freedom Now at 90.7 FM in Southern California and 98.7 FM in Central California, and streaming live on the web at www.kpfk.org. We would like to close this session of the program with a collective chant, so please join us wherever you are in the words of those freedom fighters on the motherland and in the diaspora. Amandla, which means power, and the response Awetu, which means is ours. Amandla,
Awetu.
Amandla,
Awetu.
Amandla,
Awetu.
From Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, KPFK, and with me on the line is Theresa Runstedtler, Associate Professor of History at American University in Washington, D.C., author of 2 books on blacks and sports, Jack Johnson, Rebel Sojourner, Boxing in the Shadow of the Global Color Line, and Blackball, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Spencer Haywood, and the generation that saved the soul of the NBA. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Runstedtler.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. So who was Jack Johnson, and why did you decide to write a book about him?
So Jack Johnson was the first ever Black world heavyweight champion back in the early 1900s when I was working on my graduate work at Yale University. I was looking for a way to understand popular ideas about race and imperialism, and particularly global anti-Blackness, but also African American activism transnationally. And so I came across Jack Johnson's story, and I realized that he wasn't just a famous figure within the United States, but he also became, one of the first global Black celebrities. And through his story, much of which takes place outside of the United States, I found a way to interrogate broader questions of particularly Blackness, but also race and imperial control in places like London, Paris, Cape Town, even in places like the Philippines, in India. They were all having these discussions about Jack Johnson because he was discussed at length in local newspapers, and also his fight films literally traveled around the globe in the early 1900s.
And Jack Johnson also helped to inspire this notion of the Great White Hope, which, of course, was turned into a Broadway play and a film involving James Earl Jones. What was this concept of the Great White Hope?
Well, that concept emerged in the wake of his initial defeat of Tommy Burns in 1908, when he became the first Black world heavyweight champion. And essentially at the time, race and boxing were very much intertwined, as boxers became almost like icons of not just their local communities, but also their racial identities. And so at the time, in the context of Jim Crow segregation in the United States, in the context of immigration restrictions in many of the imperial centers across the globe, such as the UK, and also places like France and other settler colonial societies, the idea that a Black man would beat a white man in the ring was so controversial to these scripts of white supremacy. And so there began this search for the ultimate great white hope to take down Johnson, who at the time held the heavyweight championship of the world. And many folks saw this as, something that was of dire consequence, because the idea that a Black man beat a white man in the ring, the spectacle of that, literally traversing the globe in print, on film, was seen as something that might upset the delicate balance of race relations in places such as Manila in the Philippines, or, for example, in South Africa, where there were many young men who were following Jack Johnson's career at that time, many young Black men.
Mm-hmm. So talk to us about his experience in Australia, which in many ways is a kind of twin or younger brother of the United States of America.
Yeah, so the Australia was seen as almost like a white outpost in the Pacific back in the early 1900s, and it was a particularly strategic location for Anglo-American power in that region, with particularly the rising power of China and also Japan. And so having this match between Jack Johnson and Tommy Burns, who was a white Canadian fighter at that time, in 1908, became a kind of showcase for white imperial power in the Pacific. At the time, the Great White Fleet was traversing the Pacific as a show, again, of Anglo-American power in the Pacific. And so when Johnson actually beat Burns, even though Australians let that match happen, something that could not have happened in the United States at that time, and they watched in horror while Burns lost very handily. Johnson beat him very handily. And, it created this massive backlash against Jack Johnson. Whereas when he first arrived in Australia, they almost greeted him like he was a minstrel character and, very non-threatening, and they didn't think much of him. But once he beat Burns, the tables turned really quickly, and he became persona non grata in Australia.
And ultimately persona non grata in the United States, which gives us an opportunity to ask you about the Mann Act, M-A-N-N Act. What was it and what impact did it have on Jack Johnson?
The Mann Act was essentially an anti-prostitution law. At the time, progressive reformers in the United States were very concerned that, in particular, young white women who were in the cities, who were single, who were no longer living with their families, were finding work in places like New York and Chicago. There was this fear that they would be, taken advantage of and be sold into prostitution, that they would be trafficked across state lines for the purposes of prostitution. And so the Mann Act, however, ended up becoming a very useful political tool for folks who wanted to clamp down on any kind of interracial relationships between white women and black men. And so the Mann Act itself was very vague in terms of, what it classified as immoral behavior. And so Jack Johnson ended up getting charged under the Mann Act for allegedly bringing his girlfriend at the time across state lines for the purposes of immoral acts or prostitution. And this became a way to literally put him on the run and push him outside of the United States. He ended up, rather than, once he got convicted for it, rather than staying and serving his prison sentence, he escaped through Canada and spent, the next, I think it was 7 years, essentially on the run in Europe and also the Caribbean and Mexico as well. So it became this way of sort of using Jack Johnson to warn other black men not to cavort with white women, and in doing so to also remind African Americans at large that they were still second-class citizens and that the color line was still very much going to be policed by state authorities.
How would you characterize this experience south of the border in Mexico?
So Jack Johnson spent some of his last years before he came back across the border to spend his time in prison. He ended up giving up in 1920 after 7 years on the run. But he became this kind of almost icon of anti-Americanism in Mexico. We have to remember that at the time, in Mexico during the revolutionary years, U.S. power was something that was very much on the minds of Mexican folks just across the border who were thinking about the encroachment of U.S. power, U.S. capitalists who were coming in to try and gain more and more control over the Mexican political and economic system. And so in some ways, Jack Johnson, because he thumbed his nose at the United States, went on the run, beat white men in the ring, and spoke openly about the racism of the United States, he became this kind of figure of anti-Americanism who was heralded by many folks locally in Mexico.
Now, a moment or two ago, you mentioned that he had a fan base of sorts in Cape Town, South Africa. How would you characterize Jack Johnson's relationship to Cape Town?
So Jack Johnson actually never set foot in South Africa. However, what was so powerful at the time was that there were, emerging transnational media, like what they called the wireless or telegraph. Newspapers were becoming much more efficient at reporting daily news from abroad. And then, of course, the fight film of his infamous fight against Jim Jeffries, who was considered to be the White Hope, who came out of retirement. He was a white American fighter, came out of retirement in 1910 to fight Jack Johnson, lost to Jack Johnson. This was all captured on film in Reno, Nevada. That film ended up making its way to South Africa. And South African authorities at that time were very worried that particularly young men who had started to migrate into the cities in South Africa, that they would be able to not just, read reports of his triumph over the Great White Hope, Jim Jeffries, but they'd actually be able to see it on film. And so they ended up trying to ban the film there. But nonetheless, regardless of any kind of bans that they put on, he became this figure that folks of color, both colored and Black South Africans, basically, became very much enamored with as a kind of figure of anti-colonialism.
Now, switching gears, Professor, as mentioned in the introduction, you also have another book, Blackball, and in the subtitle is the name Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who is probably known to many in our audience as he starred at UCLA and played for years with the Los Angeles Lakers. But also in your subtitle is Spencer Haywood, who is a figure maybe not known to our audience. Tell us about the book and tell us about the role that these two gentlemen played within it.
So Blackball, in many ways, is a kind of continuation of the work that I did in the first book on Jack Johnson. I really wanted to retell the story of how Black basketball players in the 1970s really transformed the sport, the professional game, in ways that set the stage for all of the fantastic profits and popularity of the NBA that we see now, and how, in particular, their labor fights really sort of set the stage for Black athletes to become much more iconic across racial lines, and also be able to speak out against things that they, were against politically. So Spencer Haywood is really key to this story. He actually ended up going to the Mexico City Olympics in 1968, even though at the time, of course, Harry Edwards and other Black athletes were calling for a boycott of those Olympics. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who you also mentioned, ended up deciding to stay home as his own personal protest against racism in the United States. Now, Spencer Haywood was not really, politically conscious in his early years. He had just come out of Mississippi. He, a few years before had been picking cotton. He had a lot to lose. This was his opportunity to really showcase his talents, and he became a huge star at the Mexico City Olympics. He then went back to the University of Detroit and played there. And all of a sudden, in around the same year that he was playing at the University of Detroit, a rival league to the NBA called the ABA, or the American Basketball Association, came into existence. And they did something in order to try and take talented players away from the NBA. They created something called the hardship clause. Now, at the time, the NBA had something called the 4-year rule. The 4-year rule basically meant that the NBA would not touch any college players until they were 4 years removed from their high school graduation. So the ABA essentially wanted to disrupt this gentleman's agreement between the NBA and the NCAA, which basically helped them to sort of prop up their monopolies over sport at the amateur and professional levels, respectively. And the ABA was able to draft Spencer Haywood as the first hardship clause player and he went to the ABA's Denver Rockets. Now, once Spencer Haywood made it to the ABA, even though he was feted and they claimed that he was going to be making a ton of money, he ended up figuring out that his contract was pretty terrible and that he wasn't making as much money as they claimed, that a lot of it was unguaranteed. So if the team or the league went belly up, he'd be out of his money and he'd end up having to potentially work for many more years than actually his playing years in order to recoup all of his money promised in his contract. So essentially, he defied the owners of the Denver Rockets and he, refused to play for them. They sued him. He countersued them. He ended up abandoning the ABA and signing a contract with the Seattle Supersonics of the NBA. And the NBA was not so happy about this because he was violating their 4-year rule. Because when the ABA picked him up, he was still an underclassman at the University of Detroit. Now, the reason why this was so important to the NBA to uphold the 4-year rule was that with the draft system, this meant that players came in an orderly manner. Only one team could, negotiate with one player. And from there was a reserve clause that kept that player tied to that team for the entirety of their career, unless the team owners wanted to dispense with them. So Spencer Haywood, he was challenging the 4-year rule, but he was really challenging the monopolistic practices of the NBA and also the NCAA in some respects. So he sued the NBA when the NBA said, no, you can't play. He ended up winning the right to play in the NBA. So all of this to say that he was somebody who refused to play by the traditional status quo. He refused to accept the unequal labor practices in the NBA at that time. And because of his case and his success in challenging the 4-year rule, this really set the stage for another antitrust case involving Oscar Robertson and the player representatives of the NBPA, which was the union of the NBA at that time. And they were able to challenge the reserve clause, which was the clause that kept players essentially in a form of economic bondage with under the thumb of the team owners. So in some respects, all of these legal battles that Spencer Haywood had in the early 70s with both the ABA and the NBA really opened up and began to challenge the power dynamics, the unequal power dynamics between players and team owners. And it was really quite revolutionary. we don't really talk about it anymore, which is interesting because a lot of the benefits that NBA players now have, indeed all professional athletes for the most part have, came out of this earlier moment in the 1970s and all these legal struggles.
So where's Spencer Haywood today?
So Spencer Haywood, he's living his life. The irony is that his career went downhill in the late 70s, early 80s. Anyone who has watched Showtime, the most recent series, might have caught a glimpse of a kind of sensationalized take on the latter part of his career, where he admittedly had a cocaine problem and he ended up getting kicked out of the league. He's since recovered. He's no longer an addict. He does a lot of public speaking now, and he's somebody who, has largely been forgotten in NBA history, even though he played such a pivotal role and really setting the stage for folks like LeBron James and others who came either directly out of high school or came into the league as underclassmen and bypassed, the 4-year rule.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Runstedtler, Associate Professor of History at American University in Washington, D.C., author of 2 books, Jack Johnson, Rebel Sojourner, and Blackball, about the aforementioned Abdul-Jabbar and Spencer Haywood. Thank you for joining us on KPFK Freedom Now, Los Angeles.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is her sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
Hi, my name is Marcia Bird, and my inmate number is 125-8690. I'm here in Las Vegas, private women prison, and I'm here for a DUI that went bad, and I took a deal for 2 years and ended up getting 6. But the good news is I was able to get another attorney with a habeas corpus that the court honored, and I'm going back in court to get my original 2 years. But by me being here in this prison made me more spiritual and closer to the higher power. At one time, I grew up and I knew all about religion, but I just went in one ear and out the other. But being spiritual and praying and fasting is real, and that's the best way, and that's advice I can give from my experience being here. I fast, I prayed, and I received great results. I fast about my breast cancer, which I came in with, but now that's gone. I'm in remission. And then I fast on my sentence, and I received 2 years, the original deal that I have. So I just want to encourage everyone, if they be put in a situation, just don't give up. Keep the faith. Discipline yourself. And fast. Making fast helps you spiritually, and then it helps you not only lose weight, it helps you in all kind of ways, and it helps you get closer to the higher power, and you're able to get your answers. So, everyone, Keep me in your prayers and have a great day.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
From KPFK Pacifica in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Jacob S. Dorman, Associate Professor of History at the University of Nevada at Reno, and author of the article in the current edition of the Journal of African American History, Western Civilization Through Eastern Spectacles, Duse Mohamed Ali, Black Orientalist Imposture, and Black Internationalism. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Dorman.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Horne. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Ditto. So, who was Duse Mohamed Ali, and why did you decide to write about it?
Well, thank you so much. Duse Mohamed Ali, I think, is one of the unsung heroes of the African diaspora. He is, I think, that the top line thing to know about him is that he was a very important early employer and mentor to Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who, of course, led the largest Black nationalist movement in history with millions of members around the world. And Duse Mohamed Ali then later worked for Garvey as an editor at his paper, The Negro World. But he's also foundational because he helped to found a Muslim appreciation society in Detroit in the years just before the emergence of the Nation of Islam in that city. So he's kind of a behind the scenes. Well, today he is behind the scenes, but he in his day was one of the really leading advocates of what became known as both Black nationalism and Black internationalism, and really had a very foundational impact on not only the Garvey movement, but also the Black Muslim movement.
Now, we had understood previously that Duse Mohamed Ali had roots in northern Egypt, Alexandria, if I recall correctly. But you suggest that that is inaccurate, that actually he was born and had roots in what used to be called the British West Indies. If so, what island or what territory are we talking about?
Okay, well, I mean, the short answer is that I don't know which island specifically he was from, but the article does argue that he was West Indian. The two candidates, I think, are Trinidad and Tobago and also Barbados. And I make these suggestions based on a close reading of his autobiography, which was titled Leaves from an Active Life. And he self-published this in his newspaper that he started in Nigeria towards the end of his life, called The Comet. And he serialized his autobiography and gave just really a fantastic amount of detail about his life. And many people have written about him and repeated the story that he told, which is that he was born in Egypt. There's a number of problems with that story, most significantly that the details of his life were plagiarized from a previous history of Egypt. And so, and he also there's a number of details that just don't match up. For example, he couldn't speak Arabic, but he claimed that he had been in Egypt as late as the age of 16 or 17. So it just didn't really make sense that somebody who was from Egypt and had spent a significant portion of his childhood and young adult years wouldn't know Arabic. Also, when he spent time with Orientalists, with people who studied Egypt in England, they said that he didn't know the basic statement of faith in Islam, he didn't know Egypt, he didn't know Arabic, and he didn't know much about Egyptian history. So I thought there was a much better chance that he kind of fit into a class of people who were political actors and what Robert Hill has called imposters. But I think we have to unpack what that means.
Now, speaking of that latter concept, I inferred from your article and from other reading that in North America and the African diaspora more generally, the former enslavers, post-enslavement, had done an adroit and adept job at defaming Black people, that many Black people thought the better part of wisdom was to engage in what you call imposture, to put on a fez and say that actually I'm from Alexandria, Egypt, etc. I should also mention this other point, which just came to mind, which is that during the liberation struggle in Mozambique in Southeast Africa in the 1960s, the United States was able to place a Black American agent in the ranks of the liberation movement, speaking of Leo Milas, who they said was actually Mozambican, and the founding father of modern-day Malawi, speaking of Hastings Banda, did not speak any indigenous African languages, and in fact spoke English with a U.S. accent, which raises questions about his identity as well. But in any case, Professor Dorman, what do you understand by the concept imposture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that broader context that you mentioned at first is really key. You have to realize, as you of course do, and I imagine most of your listeners do as well, that people of African descent were facing a real difficult environment, in intellectual environment, in which you had you not only had, of course, just routine oppression in employment, housing, education, daily life, harassment, police murder, and so on and so forth. You also had this kind of intellectual pincer movement that claimed that Black people were less than, that they were less than white people, that they were even less than human. And so, one way out and through that kind of intellectual difficulty was for Black people to say, okay, you don't know who we are. We actually are Asiatic, or we actually are Oriental, or perhaps just by putting on a fez or a turban, I can be viewed as this is something that Dizzy Gillespie, for example, would do when he was traveling through the Jim Crow South, is he would throw on a turban and then he would get to ride in the first class car instead of in the third class car. And this is also something that Duse Mohamed Ali did when he was traveling through the South. He put on a fez, and he was then allowed to ride in the first class car. And one of the things, although the Ottoman Empire in these years was crumbling, there still was a lot more dignity in being perceived as an Ottoman subject than being perceived as a West Indian or an African American and the descendant of slaves. It allowed greater privileges, greater freedom. And I think that, you have to understand what historians, and I guess myself included, have called imposture as a valid option when faced with the invalid options of racism, that where racism was being preached from university lecterns and from pulpits as being the way of God and the way of science. And so you have to imagine that some of these political actors, number one, that they are political actors. The imposture, as Robert Hill says is is a political act, and it's also an intellectual act. It's a kind of act of organic intellectuals, as Gramsci called them. Brandon Bird has also written about imposters as organic intellectuals. And so my work is in that vein, thinking, racism was the dominant fallacy at the time. And so by taking on new identities, individuals were able to both attain greater personal privileges, but then also call into question the reigning dominant racist discourse, which was, of course, fallacious, but also basically dehumanizing.
And that brings us to the concept of Black Orientalism, which to an extent still survives, insofar as the notion of the Asiatic black man still survives, which it could be argued arose in the context of a rising Japan and Japan's conflict with the United States and the North Atlantic countries. But how does Black Orientalism figure into your argument?
Well, I think, what I'm calling Black Orientalism is a major and underappreciated force in Black internationalism and Black nationalism. I first started seeing this when I was doing research on Harlem in the 1920s. And I saw, a lot of advertisements for people that were conjure doctors or healers or root healers who would, wear turbans or fezzes and would talk about the power of the East, the mystic East. And they were talking about the Orient, which is, a huge swath of the world, basically all of Asia. And sometimes they would combine India and Africa in the same sweep, as talking about it as a center of power that was independent of Europe and the West. And they were inhabiting a basic Orientalist binary. I mean, when we talk about Orientalism, of course, that goes back to the study of philology of Oriental languages, and then it gets involved in commerce and the commercial exploitation of the East. And then, according to Edward Said, it follows into this third space of political domination of the East. But what we see is that African Americans and West Indians were participating in Orientalist discourse as a mode of critiquing, of romanticizing the Orient and also critiquing the West. And I think this is something that perhaps creates a certain amount of frisson or a kind of a disturbance of categories when we talk about Black people inhabiting and promoting Orientalist ideas, but doing it for really to flip the valuation between East and West and saying that, as Buju Banton says, the East is the best, yes. Always be depressed, there's no life in the West. So this is coming from a Rastafarian perspective. I think Orientalism in the persona of Duse Mohamed Ali leads very directly to Garveyism. It also is a really important factor in the formation of Rastafarian, of Black Israelite, and Black Muslim religious identities. So I think inherently it's a political take, and I think what some people are uncomfortable with is the notion that Orientalism was an imperialist discourse that was the discourse of white Europeans primarily. And so therefore, how could it be used at counter purposes by people who were subalterns, who were oppressed by imperialism? And I think, when you think about the theory of discourse, which is knowledge power, which is, influence, Said's major influence was Michel Foucault. Foucault, when he was discussing discourse, said that every discourse contains the seeds of its own undoing. And I think that this is something that's really critical for people to think about, that oftentimes opposition to dominant, hegemonic, and oppressive discourses don't come from entirely outside of that discursive field. It comes from people working with that discursive field and subverting it from within. And that's essentially what Black Orientalists did.
Now let's return to Marcus Garvey. Could you expand upon his ties to Garvey and Garveyism?
Sure. So Duse Mohamed Ali spent his first 40-some years as an actor in London, as an actor and a journalist, contributing articles to several different Fleet Street publications. Now, in 1911, I believe, there was the Universal Races Congress that was held in London. It was actually organized by a couple of Jews that were part of the Ethical Culture Society, and it brought together people like W.B. Du Bois and other international figures when it came to race and race relations. Duse Mohamed Ali then got he started calling himself Duse Mohamed Ali in 1901. He got a job performing Othello at the Universal Races Congress. And then he got the mailing list of the Universal Races Congress, and he was asked to found a journal promoting West African trade by a West African fruit magnate who had interest in West African produce. And he said, well, instead of just doing this about West Africa, this is Duse Mohamed Ali, he said, we should be writing about Africa and the Orient. And he starts a publication called the African Times and Orient Review. And this is with the backing of this West African fruit magnate. So he starts this publication, and he gets the mailing list of the Universal Races Congress, and he writes to the members, the attendees, and says, what do you think of the necessity of a newspaper to talk about Africa and the Orient? And then he published their responses and publicized them as contributors, even though they didn't necessarily think that they were contributing to a paper. But he starts this journal, and then he hires a young Jamaican named Marvis Mosiah Garvey to do tasks around the office. This is when Garvey was in London before he founds the UNIA and returns to Jamaica and founds the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So Duse Mohamed Ali, publishes Garvey, one of Garvey's first articles and publications, in which Garvey put forward his view of a kind of Pan-Africanist view that argued that people of African descent around the world were facing similar travails and could band together to address those problems. Other significant ways that Duse Mohamed Ali influenced Garvey is that Duse Mohamed Ali was cooperating with these British companies that had trade with West Africa. And that's very much like Garvey's emphasis on creating the Black Star Line, the shipping line that would do trade with West Africa. So they both had a kind of a capitalist bent. They both were interested in Pan-Africanism. And even, the publication, the West African Times and Orient Review, becomes a kind of model for the Negro world. And Duse Mohamed Ali, during his time in America, which he was coming to the U.S. to promote a West African trade scheme. And then he stays on when that falls apart. He stays on and becomes an editor at the Negro World. So Duse Mohamed Ali was a really important influence on Garvey, who, of course, would go on to become much more successful and much more famous than his mentor.
You also suggest that Duse Mohamed Ali might have had an influence on the nascent Nation of Islam insofar as he spent time in the U.S. Midwest as that organization was growing. Talk to us about his relationship to the United States of America and possibly the Nation of Islam as well.
Yeah, so he moves to Detroit in 1920. As I said before, he came to the U.S. to promote this kind of West African scheme and trade scheme. While he was here, he got outmaneuvered at home and basically loses control of the company that he was representing, and he gets stranded in the U.S. At that point, he goes to Detroit. I'm not exactly sure why he goes to Detroit, but while he's there, he's recruited by members of the Ahmadi organization. The Ahmadis were a Muslim society that were promoting the kind of prophethood of Ahmad, and they were from North India, what became Pakistan. And he gets recruited by these Ahmadis to help to establish what's called the Central Muslim Society, to hold regular Friday prayers. And he remained in Detroit from 1924 to 1926. And this was a very important time in the history of the emergence of Black Muslim movements, because this was when Noble Drew Ali, the prophet, was organizing the Moorish Science Temple of America in Chicago, which he does in 1925. And the city with the largest chapter of the Moorish Science Temple was actually Detroit. And Detroit had been prepared for several years for the emergence of Muslim religions by organizations like the Central Muslim Society that Duse Mohamed Ali had helped to found. And later on, conflict with the Detroit chapter would actually bring sort of strife to the Moorish Science Temple and lead to the Moorish Science Temple falling apart with first the murder of the business manager Claude Green, and then the death, what some might see as the suspicious death of the Prophet Noble Drew Ali in 1929. In the kind of chaos that follows, the Temple of Islam is founded by Elijah Muhammad and other former members of the Moorish Science Temple in 1930. So that the Nation of Islam emerges out of the kind of discord and disarray of the Moorish Science Temple after 1929. But the Moorish Science Temple really emerges in Detroit out of the efforts, or at least was prepared for by the efforts of the Ahmadis and efforts of people like Duse Mohamed Ali, who founded the Central Muslim Society. So Duse Mohamed Ali is one of the most important influences on the Garvey movement and on the Black Muslim movement.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Dorman, Associate Professor of History at the University of Nevada at Reno, author of the article in the current edition of the Journal African American History, Western Civilization Through Eastern Spectacles, Duse Mohamed Ali, Black Orientalist Imposture, and Black Internationalism. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Ditto.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Theresa Runstedtler, Dr. Jacob Dorman. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for our sister Assumpta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. And also, please look for a Black August LA calendar for events coming up for Black August. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. As always, we stand ready for revolution.